Professor Williams' question, who are willing to answer? Yes, Professor Williams.
That's a very good question, and I think the prospect of Chinese financial collapse is real.
Yeah.
It may not happen, but it could happen, which will have horrible consequences, not just for China, but for all of us. China owns a great deal of American debt, for example, and the domino effect of Chinese financial crisis will be felt, I suspect, for a very long time across the world. But there's another thing which I wanted to add, which is that if you go around talking to Chinese Communist Party elite, the required reading these days is not Karl Marx's Das Kapital, but rather another 19th century classic of social theory, namely Alexis de Tocqueville's Old Regime and the French Revolution. And the reason Communist Party elite in China is reading this book is Tocqueville's very simple point that revolution happens not when things are getting worse, but precisely when things are getting better. So they take quite seriously that precisely it's in time of economic growth that the prospect of social upheaval is the greatest. The another thing I'd like to just add to Professor Pute's excellent response is many people I know don't want to support North Korea at all, don't want to give aid, don't want to engage. But the thought experiment I'd like to pose to you is, who would you be more scared of? Someone who has nothing to lose or someone who has something to lose? And there is a sense in which when Professor Pute talks about small things, it could be cultural exchange. It could just be a simple economic aid. And these things will give stakes, not just to the North Korean regime, but to North Korean people, that perhaps kamikaze-like end is not the best option, but rather to seek economic betterment and mutual peace.
I completely agree with the points of Professors Pute and Lee. And if I add a little bit more, then let's think about change of China. So China has changed a lot. So China still officially communist regime, but its communism is now totally different from the past. The economic opening and the reform of China happened after Nixon's rapprochement with China. Let's think about, suppose there is no rapprochement from the United States. Then would it have been possible for China to make this change? Probably it would have been very difficult to Deng Xiaoping to take this reform initiative. So engagement policy with North Korea does not guarantee North Korea will change. But current approach of just sanctioning and isolating the North will just accelerate North Korea's single-minded pursuit of nuclear capability and continuing the risky behavior. So by providing more to gain from international exchanges, North Korea and regime may have more incentives to open and reform as China, Vietnam did. So that could be our consideration.
Very interesting point. Okay, do you have any further questions? President Ritchie?
Thank you. I have 17 questions because this discussion was fascinating. But let me focus on one angle, namely the first subject of China. Because in any debate, China is, and not just in Northeast Asia, but relating to the Philippines, to Mongolia, to Vietnam, and so on, China is the elephant in the room, or the giant panda in the room. And I was struck when the speakers were referring to the internal difficulties at the absence of one or two words. So I would like to ask, is the absence of human rights in China an internal problem? Is it a problem at all? Is it internal and therefore we should not bother? Or since China also subscribes to the international theory that human rights are universal, what effect does that absence of human rights in China have on the total debate? And another word that was missing was the military. Who's actually running China? We hear now the bankers are certainly not running it, although they may be running the United States. But where's the role of the military, and who's actually giving orders for the long term? And the third word that I didn't hear was Russia. After all, Northeast Asia includes a vast Russian territory called Siberia. And even this morning's paper, you may have noticed, suggested that China should really just take over Siberia and move its surplus population there. But the Russian neighbor obviously has an influence on all the topics that have been raised. So would any of the panelists like to comment on those points?
Thank you. Could we have one more question?
Only got 3.
Hello, my name is Seung-mo Kwon. I'm from Graduate School of International Peace. So I'm really interested in peace. First of all, I really want to thank you, Professor, for a great discussion. I have one question and one comment. Since the Professor all agreed about the South Korea leading role in integration of Northeast Asia, so I want to say something different, opposition part. Because I think I think Korea cannot, because even though I'm Korean, I really love Korea, but so maybe I get criticized. But Korea already lost its momentum, the chance to be a leading role, because in year 2000, when they led President Kim Dae-jung, as we all know, he did a sunshine policy, and he got a really great support from every great power, Japan, China, Russia, and even America. But one of the reasons why Korea cannot be a leading role in Asia is like we are too subject to American policies, because, well, when the Clinton was in office, well, we got really great support. But when the Bush got the office, as it says anything but ABC policy, anything but Bush. So Clinton. So, as Professor Yu already mentioned, because the agreed framework is all canceled, and then we lost the chance to integrate North Korea into Asia. So I think there's no alternative, as Professor Yu said. I think the six-part talk is the only answer, and we have to change it into integration of Northeast Asia, as Europe did, like a CSE, from CSE to OSCE. And then my question is, I have a question for Professor Puet, since he said you studied Chinese history and you're from America. I'm really curious what South Korea should do when there's going to be sudden collapse in North Korea, because I thought that there's already a possibility, nobody knows what's going to happen. But I'm curious, because South Korea, if it has a legitimacy, if the sudden collapse, I guess there's a possibility the civil war is broken up in North Korea. But North Korea, in international law, it is regarded as a government. So if South Korea and U.S. Army went in North Korea, it's like a violation of international law. And then China is definitely going to oppose it. So I'm wondering what's your opinion, like what South Korea has to do about it. Thank you.
Okay, overall, I think we have 4.5 questions here. Now, are you willing to answer? Professor Puet, I think there was several questions on to you, right? Especially on the China. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. So let me begin with this last question, then turn to China. All of these have been outstanding questions. Specifically, what would happen in the case of a collapse of North Korean state? It would be horrific for precisely the reasons you mentioned. Indeed, The US would certainly want to be involved immediately. China would obviously want to be involved immediately. Neither would want the other to be involved. And the implications of this could be horrific, and you're talking about a country, of course, that has nuclear weapons that could fall into potentially anyone's hands. South Korea, again, would be, by definition, the major player in this. South Korea would be forced into the extraordinarily uncomfortable position of having to play against both of these powers and somehow have to make an argument as to how this horrific humanitarian crisis, which it undoubtedly would be, should be handled by these major nuclear powers, and going back to your question too, Russia would obviously be involved too. How in the world could these major powers somehow deal with this humanitarian crisis in ways that would not escalate into a war, which would be a very dangerous possibility in the midst, again, of an unbelievable humanitarian crisis? I wish I had an easy solution for how South Korea could do this. I don't, but I can certainly say how South Korea would respond to this would be crucial. South Korea is the only significant power that could potentially mediate these different areas, make an argument that South Korea ought to be the one to play a major role in dealing with this humanitarian crisis with the strong support of the other powers, but without invading armies moving in. It would not be an easy argument to make, but the key part of it would be to say it is in everyone's best interest that we both deal with the humanitarian crisis and not allow an escalation into a war. It would not be an easy part to play, but indeed, South Korea would absolutely have to be the power to play it. And it would be the most dangerous of the situation that we were mentioning earlier, where South Korea would have to play a mediating role in East Asia, and this would just be with dire consequences as to its possible failure. But I agree, South Korea would be crucial. And should we move on here, or should we turn to China? Should we?
Yeah, we
please,
can go
yes.
to Professor Yu, probably, South Korea.
I agree with the Professor overall, but if I give a little bit additional comment, a lot will depend on what kind of collapse.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the North Korean regime collapse could mean various things. So one is power struggle within regime. So which could be replaced by another power, military takeover or some faction within North Korean regime could take over. Another thing could mean more popular revolt, but so far, North Korea, we don't see any possibility of a popular revolt. In the future we don't know. In the case of East Germany, the collapse was not just regime collapse within power struggle. It was the choice of East German public that wanted integration with West Germany. So whether such kind of thing will happen in North Korea or not, that kind of internal politics will have great implications about what will be the choice of South Korea, United States, and China.
Yes. Professor Lee, do you want to add something?
I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but the best case scenario I see would be an internal war, civil war, as the remnants of the military and the party elite struggle for control of the regime, and millions of refugees streaming into China, South Korea, and some to Russia. It would be a disaster. Truly. And that's the best case scenario.
Okay, why don't we have just 2 more questions because of the limit of time.
Should we go to the 3 of the 17 questions?
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, why don't we go back to the questions? Who's going to ask? Yeah, why don't you, Professor Pugh? Yes.
Sure, yeah, I'll be happy to. Excellent set of questions, and I'll refer back to the earlier question, too, about China. Yes, the current economic instability and social dislocation going on in China is extraordinary. Again, when you read the paper about this rising China, they're looking at a thing, namely the growing economy, which is extraordinary. Spend any time in China, what you will see is a wealth disparity that is unbelievable, dislocation between urban and rural areas that is startling. Rural discontent, to put it mildly, is at unbelievable levels, I mean, to the point of just constant riots going on, unbelievable problems. Indeed, as you mentioned, this is playing out in many ways, but certainly one of the ways this is playing out with a tremendous amount of corruption going on is a push toward increasingly authoritarian tendencies on the part of the government to try to control this, increasingly lending support to the military and playing into nationalistic concerns to try to ease these social tensions, all of which is playing out in very dangerous ways. And absolutely, in terms of human rights, things are not going well. In terms of potential support for an authoritarian regime for other actors that might be supportive, say Russia, is clearly ongoing. Many, many dangerous tendencies playing out. But as we've mentioned, of course, there are other tendencies too. And part of the concern now for the international community is to create a situation in which we are trying not to allow those strongly nationalistic and authoritarian tendencies to become so powerful, to try to create a situation in which that can be somewhat eased, and hopefully by doing so, bring out other voices that would be working against these authoritarian tendencies, this incredible corruption, bring out voices that are trying to create a more efficient government, trying to be much more responsive to the population, dealing with these extraordinary problems. How is this going to play out? I would not dare to predict. But one thing I would say is we could easily imagine here too, a complete collapse where China would move toward a more authoritarian regime, more corrupt, yielding more power to the military, and a disaster ensuing. We can imagine other scenarios too. And let's just remember one, who knows if it would be a parallel, but something to think about. Look at what a country called the United States of America looked like at the beginning of the 20th century, when it had this extraordinary economic growth that was on the verge of becoming perhaps the largest economy in the world. But oh my gosh, it was the country in which the government was completely controlled by a tiny oligarchic elite. The wealth disparity was unbelievable. There was institutionalized racial apartheid in this country. There were children were working in the factories, and the government was constitutionally incapable, not allowed to, pass regulations to protect the children because it was constitutionally prevented from having a federal government that could actually do regulations across the states. It started playing into some horrible nationalistic tendencies. America started engaging in imperialistic wars, playing all of this out in precisely the ways you could imagine. Now, America still has lots of problems, but over time, America at least ended its racial apartheid. We allowed women to vote. We now have laws that prevent 12-year-olds from working in factories. So it is also possible in the right situation that other voices can come out, in which governments can actually pull themselves together, in which you actually can create workable scenarios. And so I think, even though we have no idea how things will play out in China, the key is, can we help to create the conditions in which better tendencies, I think better from not just our point of view, but from everyone's point of view, can play out? And I think at least we can try to do that and hope for the best.
Okay, now, just one last question. Yes, Professor Saul?
Okay. Great thoughts, great insights, and I've learned a lot, and I truly appreciate it. But at the same
could you
time,
stand up, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. But at the same time, I guess to make the complete picture, or to make to connect the dots, I guess we have to talk about a U.S. foreign policy. And I hope that today's panel theme is not, let's put aside U.S. foreign policy for the time being. But my question may sound a little bit weird, because my question is not about U.S. response, but mainly about U.S. no response. So, I mean, if you think about, or if you look at domestic setting of American foreign policy, I don't think that you can see any serious or real enthusiasm or attention or concerns amongst the American public, and even inside the Beltway. So we've been talking about a rising China, dangerous Japan, nuclear North Korea, and what to do about it, South Korea. But where is America? And And if I recall correctly, President Obama has not mentioned any single word about North Korea during his State of the Union address back in Japan. So I'm just wondering why no serious or real kind of response from the United States? Thank you.
Thank you. I think this question could be applied to all three of you in here. Professor Lee, do you want to go first?
Sure. One broad answer, of course, is that U.S. remains very much a Eurocentric power. The foreign policy establishment basically resides in the Beltway in Washington, D.C., with branches in New York, and the fundamental gaze is toward the Atlantic, not to the Pacific. So that's one reason. And second, I mean, President Obama is probably the president most associated with Asia Pacific. He grew up in Indonesia, of course, and Hawaii later. And he does have some interest, not just about East and Southeast Asia, but also about Asian Americans and so on. However, the reality is, on the one hand, as I kept on emphasizing, the primacy of domestic politics. I mean, the things he wanted to achieve most were healthcare reform and other things about which foreign policy will always get in the way. But at the same time, it's very difficult for U.S. president really to fundamentally shift U.S. attention away from Europe and South America, Central America, to Asia. What's more interesting, though, is it's precisely in the non-foreign policy establishment, that is to say the self-styled educated elite within the US, which I think has been turning decisively toward East Asia. Whether you go to very elite private schools in Manhattan or other traditionally elite boarding schools or other universities, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and whatnot, just the sheer interest in learning Chinese, learning about East Asia has been skyrocketing. So I suspect that things will change, but currently, very much the establishment remains in this Eurocentric world. And so it's not surprising to me that Asia remains very much an afterthought.
Yes, Professor Pugh, do you want to add something more?
Oh, I will just completely underline those points. I think that's exactly right. I think when Obama made the argument that the U.S. needs to shift its focus toward the Pacific, I have no doubt that he was completely sincere in that statement. And yet, as Professor Lee has mentioned, it's really not led to much of a shift at all. And I think the reason is precisely the foreign policy establishment knows nothing about Asia. And true policies toward Asia have really not changed significantly. As we've mentioned, U.S. policies have largely created a very dangerous situation in a number of areas, and those have really not changed a bit. Like Professor Lee, I'm optimistic in the long run. I too have noticed the sea change among students. 20 years ago, when I first started teaching, there was relatively low interest in Asia, which is amazing to imagine, but it really was the case. Now it's not the case at all. My students, the interest levels is extraordinary in East Asia, and of course, these are the generations that will later play a crucial role in whatever world that's going to be created, so I'm optimistic, but we're talking decades, and that's a while away. So I agree. I think we have a fundamental problem. I think the U.S. is, needless to say, a major player in Northeast Asia, to put it mildly. And we have a country that really does not understand the tensions and complexities going on. It has a foreign policy, even when at best well-intentioned, that oftentimes is creating very dangerous situations apart from its intended goals. And if we have a 2-decade wait until this new generation will be running things, we have a problem, and I think we need to confront that problem very seriously and try very hard, and again, I think South Korea could play a major role in this, to make powerful arguments to Washington as how it needs to rethink its foreign policy in ways that will be helpful as opposed to destructive of the larger goals we've been discussing this evening.
Thank you. Professor Yu, do you have any last comment on the question?
So basically, I agree that U.S. has less attention to the Asia, partly because of Eurocentric position, but also because of pressing more imminent issues from Middle East. So Obama administration has inherited the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and then you see continuing problems from Middle East, and North Africa, and now Ukraine, and because of these more pressing concerns, the United States was unable to pay much attention to North Korea. And in addition, while Obama indicated during the presidential campaign that he is willing to engage with those countries like North Korea, Iran, but North Korea made it very difficult for Obama administration to constructively engage with North Korea, because North Korea pushed too hard, too much brinkmanship tactics made it very difficult for Obama administration to get sufficient domestic support to engage with North Korea. So for these kind of reasons, Obama administration just stick to the policy of strategic patience, which meant doing nothing. And for example, John Kerry, before becoming Secretary of State, criticized the strategic patience. But after becoming Secretary of State, he's just doing that again. So that explains the difficult situation for U.S. Position in Korean Peninsula.
Thank you so much. Well, I think it's really a time for us to wrap up our dialogue series today. I want to give my real sincere gratitude to all of our guest speakers here. Why don't we give a big hand to them one more time?
Also to Professor Jong.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Again, it was a great pleasure and honor for me to be moderating today's dialogue. And thank you very much for joining us here today. Thank you, and have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.